If I showed you these hands without a solver, you'd think that the line is counterintuitive, but oftentimes in 3-bet pots there are some plays which look marginal but can actually be pretty clear if we understand the logic behind it. In the first hand, we open from the button Jack 10 suited and face an 11 big blind 3-bets from the big blind who is a pretty decent regular. We call. Flop is 9-7-5 2 tones and we face a half pot c-bet with gut shots, 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw. We cannot do anything else but call right now. And this is where things get interesting, as my opponent bets about 60% of the pot and I decide to call again with my hand. The river is a 4 which completes the flush, villain checks, and we have a pretty mandatory bluff here. We jam and we take it down. At first, you might think, isn't it too wide to float the turn with a hand as weak as just gutshot and 2 overcards here? And what might actually surprise you is the way that the solver handles this spot. So first of all, this is by no means a range bet spot, and we expect the out of position player to find some checks. Therefore, they will not always c-bet their overpairs and their sets or other strong hands like top pairs, for example, or also some strong draws. Again, not much to say about the flop. This is pretty clear in terms of decisions. But if we see a turn deuce, now let's think about what is villain barreling with. And if you remember, we have Jack 10 of clubs. Clubs is the backdoor flush draw on the flop. Therefore, villain is incentivized to bluff with hands which don't contain a club. For example, we can see that hands with like ace jack with the ace of spades bet fairly often, but they always check when the hand has a club. So you can see that there is a specific suit play here. The same thing goes for 2 random overcards like king jack with a spade. The combos with the club are always checking. The same logic applies with king of spade queen x. Once the out of position player barrels, what they're trying to fold are hands such as king queen of clubs, king jack of clubs, king 10 of clubs. Of course, some floatings like these overcards with the backdoor flush draw. And you can see that there is a clear distinction. The solver is pure calling jack 10 of clubs here, because again, the other combos are indifferent. That's just because villain is not bluffing with clubs. Therefore, when we have the clubs, it's more likely that they're bluffing and that they can potentially give up on the river. But now you might say, but what if villain is not playing like that? First of all, this is possible. I think a lot of players will not understand this nuance, but allow me to say that these combos are still indifferent, so it's not we're making an approximation mistake of calling hands which should be frequency folds, but we are at least defending some of those with reasonable frequency. So in game I decided to call this one pure, and I would think about randomizing the other ones. Actually, I expected Jack 10 not of clubs to be a fold fairly more often than this. But again, it's very important to understand how your range looks like here. On this river, you can see that villain is supposed to jam the overpairs, but to check with the top pairs. So Jack 10 has not only a gutshot, but also overcards to the top pair. So this is also something important and worth noting. Once they check, we have a pretty mandatory bet here. And you can see that it's not supposed to be close to even. So villain has very tough decision once they get to the river with 9x hands. So again, very important how to approach these turns. Prioritize combos which are pure defenses and understand why you want to defend this hand. Again, here you're supposed to fold a lot, and the bet size that my opponent chose is not huge, so we still have to defend a reasonable amount. You can even see that some overcards, such as ace queen, defend, because here this is our best overcard besides the ace king combination that we will call at a super low frequency there. So jack 10 becomes the second best non-flush draw overcards that we can have. And actually it's even better than ace queen because it has more equity against the already made hands in the fact that it can make the nuts. In the second hand we have king 10 suited. We open again from the button and face a 3-bet by a straightforward regular. We are slightly deep, so we are approximately 135 big blinds deep. And we defend. Flop is king 8-4 two tones. My opponent c-bets 40% of the pot. So this deep, in theory, this is not supposed to be a range play, but it's definitely a high frequency play. But I expect an average regular to probably go for range with this size, which is a bit more accurate when you are 100 big blinds deep if you want to go for range. But again, there's not much we can do with this hand except besides call. So we call. And the turn is the 6 of spades, and villain checks. So here it's very important to understand how we want to structure our range, and mainly we want to be very polarized. So being this deep, villain is not supposed to be capped. However, I suspect that a more straightforward player might bet ace king way more often than they should there. But my hand doesn't have 3 streets of value, so I think in theory this is supposed to be a pure check, but against a more straightforward opponent we can also consider betting sometimes. But there is of course a drawback if you always bet this hand. Well, of course you get value in the short term, but this is of course a bet fold in case we bet. And also I want to be able to represent top pair once the turn goes check check. So I think the theory play here is to check, and against this player you can do whatever. But in this case, I went with theory and I went with the check. The river is a 5, which completes a straight with a 7. So here I don't expect to see big bets from my opponent because this card is reasonably decent for us. So I expect to see some block bets for sure. But my opponent checks again. And here I think most players are just going to check back. And actually, in theory, this hand is very, very close. But what I think is that I expect my opponent to bet their entire range on the flop. I expect them to be more straightforward on the turn, therefore to have less slow plays with the ace-king. So their range is more saturated in terms of middle pairs, pocket queens through pocket nines, ace-8. And therefore, I decide to bet with a fairly large bet of about 70% of the pot, and villain pretty quickly actually calls with pocket jacks with the jack of clubs and the jack of hearts, which is probably the worst possible call you can find in this spot, and we win a nice pot. But let's actually see what the solver has to say about the hand. So you can already see that this is not a range bet scenario, although I expect my opponent to go for it. And you can see that most of the hands that are mixing between bet and checks are exactly those pocket pairs. This becomes especially relevant for how the hand develops. Against this bet, we basically just want to call with our continuing range. And on the 6, you can see that my opponent is supposed to start polarizing. And ace-king is finding a ton of checks with the idea of check shoving there. So one common mistake that a lot of players will make here is to bet too often with this part of the range. And once they check, again, remember they are saturated more often with these middle pairs. You can see that in theory, our hand is a pure check. And if we start to see the EV, you can see that it's not close in theory. There is a whole BB per 100 difference between bet and check. But again, if we expect villain to make a mistake and to be weaker then they should be, we can also consider starting to bet here. But you can see that basically it's not to have three streets, right? Even if they have queens or jack, they're not calling us often enough to justify betting the turn, because again, we cannot really jam the river if we bet the turn. And you can also see that, again, if we bet king queen plus can jam, and basically king jack, king 10, king 9 would be a disaster call. So we check. River is the 5 of spades, and as anticipated, you will mostly see just block bets here. There are some checks with the ace king, but right now ace king cannot check shove because the hand is not strong enough and our range is pretty much protected there. You can see that villain is not capped, as they would have some 7-6 suited, 8-7 suited, pocket 7s that can check shove, and also ace 7. So once they check, you can see that king jack, king queen, king 10, all are indifferent between bet and check. You can see we can play with a very polarized all-in bet or with some 70% pot bet. You can also use 50% of the pot bet if you want instead of 70%. I think there is a slight prevalence for the 70%, so that's what I want to use in general. And our hand is indifferent, so how do we choose whether to bet or check here? And again, the first thing is flop play. If our opponent is betting too often with those pocket pairs, then we can target those hands on the river. Second thing, how often do they have ace king? And again, if they bet it more often on the turn or they block bet for value on the river, then they have less hands that beat us, more hands that we beat, and therefore it's an easy value bet. Furthermore, if they make a call such as jack of hearts, jack of clubs, which is losing 6 big blinds per 100, our play is even more justified. Let me know your thoughts in the comment, and please subscribe if you haven't already and join our Discord.